The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
As someone who enjoys trying out different makeup looks but doesn't wear a ton on a daily basis, I like to focus on making sure I have high quality staples. And regardless of your makeup routine, you've probably seen Thrive Cosmetics Viral Tubing Mascara. I've certainly seen it everywhere. It's in that turquoise tube and it's become my go-to for mascara because it doesn't clump or smudge and it comes off really easily with just water. So that mascara, along with all of Thrive Cosmetics beauty products, are certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free. Their bestsellers have thousands of 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. Their products are great. I love a multi-purpose makeup product, and their brilliant eye brightener is perfect to use as eyeliner, eyeshadow, even highlighter. I'd recommend using shade Stella for that. They all have a shimmer, and Stella is this really pretty champagne color that looks great on a variety of skin tones. Something I also didn't know from all the mascara videos I saw is that for every product sold, Thrive Cosmetics donates either that same product, another product that's needed more, or a monetary donation towards 8 major causes, including those impacted by cancer, domestic abuse, and veteran and education organizations. So refresh your everyday look with Thrive Cosmetics. It's beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and I want to introduce myself because, I try to think about this every time I do an episode. Someone is listening to this podcast for the first time. And I'm pretty sure that whenever I do somebody that's better known, like when I cover a more famous historical person, there's a few more new people are interested or might come and join the show. And I want to let those people know what they're in for, basically. So, and one of the reasons I want to do that is, and one of the reasons I know that happens is that sometimes, I see the comments people leave on Spotify and other places. And sometimes it's people who expect the show to be a certain thing. And when it's not, they express their displeasure in the form of comments that I see and generally don't publish. So I want to just let everybody know what they're in for, because today we're talking about Sally Hemings, who is, as I understand it, pretty well known in the US as a person, as a part of American history. And so welcome new people who haven't listened to this podcast before. I'm going to break it down for you. So first of all, the show is called Vulgar History. And the reason it's called Vulgar History is because before I was doing this podcast, I was writing historical essays about people, and the whole vibe of these essays is what I bring to this podcast as well, which is kind of like I research something and then I rephrase it in a way that's conversational, that's casual, and that is a way that I find I can understand things better when I understand a story well enough that I can explain it in a casual way. That means I know that I understand it well enough. And I have found through the success of this podcast that people are into that. And so when I was writing these essays, they were very conversational and they had swear words in them and stuff. I got a comment at one point from somebody who will never know, because I'm sure they don't follow me anymore, how they helped me figure out this brand, because they left a comment being like, I like your essays, but I wish you didn't use so much vulgar language. And then I called this podcast Vulgar History, so people know that I'm going to use vulgar language. And I want to just briefly define Oxford Dictionary. There's a couple different meanings of vulgar. And the first meaning of the word means characteristic of or belonging to the masses. So it didn't used to mean the way the context that the word vulgar has now. What it originally meant is this is the way that normal everyday people talk. This is not special, it's not the way that people who go to university talk like in oldie times. People who, the priests or like the kings, like the vulgar tongue is what it was called. It's like the way that everyday people talk. And it was looked down upon as a less important or a less acceptable way to talk, but it was how people talked. So, and eventually most people talk this way. When you listen to even today's, wealthy billionaires or whatever, they try to be like, hey guys, how are you? Like they're talking in a way to try to appeal to the vulgar tongue. They want to be like, I'm just like you. So that's one meaning of the word vulgar. It means the way that just people talk when they're talking to each other, when they're not doing a presentation, when they're not being fancy. And that's what this podcast is. I'm just talking to you like I met up for a friend and we're over some cocktails and I'm just like telling you some stuff I've been researching. That's the vibe. I'm going to talk casually. I'm going to say like a lot. One might say I say like a normal amount. I'm going to say I'm going to interrupt myself. I'm going to go off on tangents because that's what this podcast is. It's casual talking. So if that's not your thing, if you want to just hear somebody read and list off facts from a prepared script, there's lots of podcasts like that. And or you could read an encyclopedia. You could read a lot of biographies of people. If you want to listen to an audiobook version of a biography of people. That's not what the show is. Now, in recent times, the word vulgar is more generally understood to mean explicit and offensive reference to sex or bodily functions, coarse and rude. Example, a vulgar joke. And you know what? The show is that also. I make jokes. I make some racy jokes. I talk about body parts, and I'm going to do that as well. And also vulgar is currently understood to mean lacking sophistication or good taste, unrefined, which this podcast also is. So I like the name Vulgar History. Like I first chose it just to troll this person who said a silly thing to one of my essays. And then also I like that it's all three meanings. Like this is history for the masses. This is history for just the average person. And I'm also going to make explicit jokes. And I'm also going to be lacking sophistication. And that's what this show is bringing to you. So point number one is that. Point number two is at the top of every episode. And this is why I say it, so people know what they're in for as well. This is a feminist women's history comedy podcast. And from the beginning, I defined the show in that way. So people know it's not a super academic podcast that is going to uphold the way that history has so often been taught. So for instance, feminist. The way I define myself, I like to define myself by that word because for a long time I didn't. I know that right now it's like maybe not a popular way to define yourself. So I especially like to use it now because some people are just like, oh, I'm not feminist. That's like man hating. And like, yeah, it is for me. Technically it's not, but for me, so many stories about history that people have been taught over the last, let's say, 100 years. The way that history is written down, like not just history is written by the victors, but it's also like, look at these great men, quote unquote. Look at the great things they did. And a lot of them did shitty things and they were not actually great. But in order to make them seem great, you have to bypass a lot of the shitty things they did and the other people who were negatively affected by the things they did. So I'm looking at stories on this podcast in a way that basically shit talks the patriarchy. And that also means looking at and elevating the stories of marginalized people in all kinds of different ways, like poor people, people of color, queer people, like looking at the stories of people who are not the like white cishet, quote unquote, great men of history. But also like the patriarchy includes like white supremacy and like colonization and stuff. And this podcast is looking at stories not from that point of view, not from the point of view that those things were good or inevitable. This is also feminist women's history, which basically is overlaps with what I just said. But, I'm going to be talking shit about the quote unquote great men of history. And it's a comedy podcast. And I say that because I'm going to be making jokes. I'm going to be having long asides. There's going to be tangents. As a thought occurs to me in the middle of a story, I might start talking about, like, for instance, the 1976 British miniseries I, Claudius. I call it a comedy podcast, and I know there's lots of people who find lots of things I do funny, and then there's also people who think that it's going to be like the sort of podcast that comedians do, where it's just like joke, joke, joke. It's more like, especially if you listen to a lot of episodes, like you'll see the kind of recurring inside jokes we have. But anyway, I'm saying all that for people who are new to this podcast, so you can opt out at this point if that's not the sort of podcast you want to listen to. Furthermore, because today we're talking about Sally Hemings, we're talking about American history, I think it's important for people to know that I am Canadian, not American. And this means that every country I talk about, except for Canada, I am looking at inherently as a foreign country because it is. I did not grow up in America. I did not grow up being taught American history, nor did I grow up being taught, Swedish history or New Zealand history or Indian history. Like, all of these things are new to me. And so I'm just learning them for the first time now as an adult. And so I want to let American people know, you may not be aware, Americans, of how much of the world's pop culture has Americans as kind of the main characters of it, like movies and TV shows and celebrity gossip. Like, people all around the world know about like the traditions of American Thanksgiving, or the fact that you have like founding fathers, or like who George Washington is, like in a way that Americans in general don't know those sorts of things about the history of Finland or like Hungary, so I'm learning things about American history that Americans might assume people already knew, but I didn't. So also, I guess, content warning, I'm going to be shit talking over this season of the podcast, which is looking at the revolutions of the long 18th century. I'm going to be shit talking most of the American founding fathers, because turns out, like, when you're reading their story and you weren't growing up reading sort of like the propaganda about how they were all so great and everything they did was so great, like when you're just looking at it from an objective point of view, like, turns out they were all kind of shitty people who did kind of shitty things, except for maybe Benjamin Franklin, but I haven't read about him super a lot, and I reserve the right to shit talk him later. Anyway, if this is not your thing, hearing America spoken about as a foreign country being examined in an objective way, then there are lots of other podcasts you can listen to instead. Or you could go and listen to the cast recording of the musical Hamilton. Those songs are great. So we're going to be talking today about Sally Hemings. She's one of the most famous people, one of the most famous women in American history, I think, based on a survey I did of American listeners. I recorded the actual story about her a bit ago, and I'm pretty sure I explained all that stuff in that. So let's just cut right to it. We're going to talk about Sally Hemings here on Vulgar History. So, Sally Hemings. Now, I did a little survey a few months ago of just asked people on Patreon, asked people in my Instagram stories, just Americans. I was curious to know how famous various people are in America, because we're going to be talking about American people in the next several episodes. And I just really wanted to, because I'm Canadian. I have never studied colonial history. I just kind of vaguely know there was these guys with little ponytails on, the musical Hamilton I'm familiar with. Anyway, so I was just curious how famous who is in America. And I was interested to see that today's subject, Sally Hemings, is the second best-known woman on my list of people. The best-known woman, Martha Washington. More on her in a future episode. But Sally Hemings, 76.9% of people surveyed had heard of her, which is much higher than most of the other women on the list. So she's someone who Americans know about. And people not in America, I don't know how much you know about her or not. But what I want to do in this episode, and we'll see if I accomplish this, is to tell her story the way that I did if you listen to the Mary Queen of Scots season, assuming not explaining what's going on until this thing happens. I don't want to have a lot of foreshadowing because some of the writings about this, most of the writings about her, assumes a certain knowledge of American Revolutionary history that I didn't necessarily have, that people listening may or may not have. So I'm just going to really explain this. I'm Canadian, so as objectively as I can, just looking at the history of another country that I'm not super familiar with. I do want to shout out friend of the podcast, Lana Wood Johnson, who did help me in a few clutch moments in the research of this, specifically involving presidential elections and American history. And the main/only source I used for this episode was the incredible book, The Hemings of Monticello, An American Family by Annette Gordon Reed. I had done an episode on Patreon. I do episodes there sometimes about just terrible men from history. And I did one about Thomas Jefferson. And in so doing, I had listened to some podcasts about him. And spoiler, Thomas Jefferson is going to be in the story. And Sally Hemings' life intersects with his. And so I was like, well, first I could just dust off those notes and just focus on Sally Hemings a bit more. But I was like, I want to read more about Sally Hemings. And so this seems to be, as far as I could tell, the book on the topic. This book, so it's from 2008 by American historian Annette Gordon Reed. And she did so much work. She studied legal records, diaries, farm books, letters, wills, newspapers, archives, and also oral history from the Hemings family. And so the book has won 16 awards. I was reading the book and I was like, wow, this is a really good book, but it's also very dense in a way that the books I look at for research aren't always. I would have to read a page or two and just take a moment to absorb what I just read, then read the next page. It's so full of such interesting, thoughtful, thought-provoking information. And then I'm like, oh, okay, because this book won the Pulitzer Prize. And actually, Annette Gordon Reed was the first African-American to be awarded this prize. It's also won so many prizes, the National Book Award for nonfiction, all kinds of things. So this is an incredibly good book. And so what I did with this book is, A, read it, and then B, just really pull out just the Sally stuff. So I really recommend this book because there's lots of sort of side characters who show up. Sally, some of her siblings, if you want to know what happens with them or with some of the Jefferson people, she really talks about everyone's life. It's big. The intersection of all these people over several generations in this book is really good. But what I pulled out for this episode is Sally herself, because I want this episode to be a tribute to a woman who is often a supporting character or a side note in the lives of other people. I wanted to just make her the main character. So, Sally Hemings. Her mother was named Elizabeth Hemings, sometimes called Betty Hemings. And Elizabeth Hemings, Sally's mom, was born in the 1730s in Virginia. So this was a time when chattel slavery was dramatically expanding in Virginia. And just so we're all clear, chattel slavery refers to the colonial system of slavery, which was practiced in all of the original 13 British colonies in what is now America. In this system, enslaved people were the personal property of their owners for life, a source of labor or a commodity that could be willed, traded, or sold like livestock or furniture. And so we're back in Virginia. If you just joined us this season, you may not have heard a month or two ago, we did an episode in that between seasons era where I was talking about Matoka, aka Pocahontas, and that was the founding of Virginia. So this is the same Virginia 116 years later from when Matoka/Pocahontas was there. And so Virginia, bear in mind, was founded by the Virginia Company, not a country, by a company, as a money-making enterprise. So Virginia was a place for men to seek their fortunes,
versus some of the northern colonies in what is now the United States, where it was like Puritans fleeing religious persecution. This was like all business. In order to make money doing business, and the business was agriculture based largely, they needed to get as much physical labor done as possible, but they needed to pay as least amount of money on that physical labor, which is why these men, for they were men, turned to chattel slavery workers that they didn't pay and who would work for them forever. And then this was a different form of slavery than what had been in place in England. Like these guys came over from England, the Virginia Company, and then they invented their own system of bondage that was based on race. So back in England, because this is all pre-American Revolution, it's all British people. So in Britain, a person's status was based on who their father was. And then in 1662, when the Virginians were inventing the rules for their kind of slavery, they were like, how about not that? How about we go back to like ancient Roman days to the rule partus secutar ventrum, which means whoever your mother was is what your identity is going to be. So this meant that children would inherit enslaved status from their mother, even if their father was not enslaved. And this removed an escape route for children born to enslaved mothers in that, and this is a way that the Virginia slavery could like keep perpetuating itself and eventually not have to keep taking more people from African countries, like the enslaved women would have children and those children would become the new slaves. Yeah, so children were born enslaved due to who their mother was, even if a white father, for instance, like a white plantation owning enslaver father, like that child, if it was born to an enslaved woman, would still be enslaved. There was no legal advantage to being mixed race or light skinned because everything came down to your mother's identity, not what she looked like. So Elizabeth Hemings, Sally's mom, was born in this situation. Her mother, Parthenia, had been an enslaved woman from Africa, and her father, we just know his last name was Hemings, was a captain of an English trading vessel. And this is where she got her surname from, Hemings, which the Hemings of Monticello is the name of the book that I read. Like she proudly carried on this surname. So she was born at a plantation in Virginia called Bermuda Hundred, and that's where she grew up until age about 11. And the reason that she was moved at that point was that the owner's daughter had brought her and other enslaved people with her because she got married. And that's kind of how, and we'll see this happen in other times in the story, when the daughter of a plantation house got married, then she would go to start her own new household and she'd bring with her some of the enslaved people who she had inherited from her parents. So the owner's daughter at this point is named Martha Epps. And there's going to be numerous Marthas in this story, so we're going to call her Martha 1. So Martha 1 got married to John Wayles, and so Elizabeth was moved to go serve her in that household. So when Elizabeth had been born, her father, Captain Hemings, acknowledged her as his daughter, which is why she has this surname. Everyone knew that she had this surname, like it was accepted she had this surname. After she was moved to go live with Martha 1, her father, Captain Hemings, tried to buy her, which we'll also get into more of this later on in the story, but this was a way. I don't know, Annette Gordon Reed doesn't know exactly what the context was of why Captain Hemings was trying to buy his daughter, but this was a way that some families could stay together. Mixed race families would be if you buy the enslaved child of your Black sexual partner, then at least they'd be under your roof, they'd be in your home. But when Captain Hemings tried to buy Elizabeth, Mr. Wayles refused to sell the child. Captain Hemings then tried to steal Elizabeth away, but was stopped. And so Elizabeth's life, much like the life of her daughter, Sally, was affected by the fact that she was probably very beautiful. And I want to emphasize this is not to do with skin tone necessarily. Like she was a mixed race woman, so probably a bit lighter skin tone. But lighter skin tone wasn't necessarily seen as like that's more beautiful. It's just like her facial features. Like she was probably just seen as beautiful to other people. And this affected the way that people treated her. They treated her a bit differently. This is maybe part of why John Wayles, Martha 1's father, refused to sell her. Like maybe he was like, well, she's 11, but she's like really pretty. And I just want to kind of see how this goes. I want to keep this really pretty young girl around me. So as a young child, as an 11-year-old, her duties probably included household chores other than cooking. She's too young for cooking. She's just 11 at this point. She probably served as nurse or minder. So, gosh, we're already into all of the Marthas. So Martha 1 was the owner's daughter. She got married to John Wayles. She then died, giving birth to her daughter, Martha 2. So Elizabeth, 11 years old, 12 years old, she probably became sort of like a nurse/helper to Martha 2, the little baby. And young enslaved girls would have been considered suitable to look after a very young child, or at least helping an older woman to do so. So Elizabeth, Martha 2, they spending time together in this situation. And then the years go by, and Elizabeth, when she was 18 years old, she also became a mother. Her first child was a daughter who she named Mary. 2 years later, she gave birth to Martin. 4 years later to Betty, and 2 years later to Nancy. No record of the identity of these children's father has been found, even by Annette Gordon Reed, who was like, goodness knows, doing all of the work, looking at all these papers and things. But part of what she was looking at, Annette Gordon Reed, is family tradition, oral history, which suggests that these children may have been fathered by a white man, but other people suggest maybe their father was a black man. We just don't know who the dad was of these children. During this period of time, when Elizabeth was being a young woman, a young mom, John Wayles married 2 more times because he married and then his wife died, and then he married and his wife died. So his second marriage produced a daughter, Elizabeth, who we're going to call Elizabeth II, because Elizabeth Hemings is Elizabeth I. Elizabeth II comes up later. And then he got married again to a woman also called Elizabeth, Elizabeth III. So America, I was having a nice time reading, well, as nice time as one can have reading American history. I was appreciating the fact that everyone in the story was not unlike in the Mary Queen of Scots season called Mary or James, but it turns out everyone is called Elizabeth and Martha. So yeah, same thing everywhere. Anyway, so Elizabeth III becomes John Wayles' third wife. And by then, Elizabeth Hemings had this clearly established kind of special status in the eyes of the Wayles family, different from other enslaved people. So, for instance, when John Wayles married Elizabeth III, he wrote out a new will, because when you marry wife, then, she's going to inherit stuff, and like what are her children going to inherit? And he specifically singled out Elizabeth Hemings and another enslaved woman called Jenny, who was the cook, to become property of his new wife should he predecease her. Then upon her death, they would be inherited by his daughter, Martha II. Ultimately, there's a lot of will talk in this episode. But what this really meant was that Elizabeth III inheriting wasn't as important as the fact that he wanted Elizabeth Hemings and Jenny the cook to go to Martha II eventually. And this could just be he wanted to ensure his daughter got a good cook and housekeeper. So Elizabeth Hemings was a standout in that way. She was one of 2 people named, although note that she was listed as Elizabeth or Betty Hemings. Jenny the cook, no surnames. That's because Elizabeth's dad, Captain Hemings, had acknowledged her as his daughter. Not all enslaved people had that. They didn't all have surnames. So the wife, my goodness, so Elizabeth III. Elizabeth III, this wife, John Wayles' third wife, died, after which John Wayles began fathering children with Elizabeth Hemings. So over the next 10 years, they had 5 children together, 5 mixed-race children. Robert, James, Thenia, Critta, and Peter were their names. So these children had 3 white grandparents and 1 black grandparent. So in the book, Annette Gordon Reed describes, you could say these are 3/4 white people, but born into slavery. And again, your skin tone didn't affect your status of being enslaved or not. It was just who was your mother. So if you think about this, so Elizabeth Hemings, just in terms of, because what everybody looks like does come up again and again in this story. So Elizabeth Hemings was mixed race. She had a white father and a black mother. Then she had these children with a white man. So she was a mixed race woman who had children with a white man. So the skin tone is getting lighter and lighter of these children. all of the children also inherited her surname, Hemings, instead of John Wayles' surname. So he didn't acknowledge them the same way that Captain Hemings had, but kind of everyone knew that he was the father of these children. So in terms of what these people all look like, and I mean, spoiler, Sally Hemings is the youngest child of this pairing of people. So when she was older, Sally was described as being, quote, near white, light-skinned with straight hair down her back. So this is what they're all kind of looking like, so we can picture them. There's no portraits at all of any of these people in the story, any of the Hemingses, I mean. So we can sort of imagine maybe what she looked like. So Elizabeth Hemings having children with John Wayles. And her son Peter was born the same year that Martha too. Remember, she was a little baby who Elizabeth watched when she was like a teenager. Martha too, now hot and teen as well, started being courted by her husband-to-be, who was a lawyer named Thomas Jefferson. And so Martha too married Thomas Jefferson in 1772. And it's basically like 9 months later, Martha too had a daughter. Guess what she called her daughter? Martha. This is Martha 3. And then 1 year later, Elizabeth Hemings had her sixth and final child, fathered by John Wayles, who was a daughter named Sarah, but always called Sally Hemings, which is the main person who we're building up to talking about in this episode. But just bear in mind that Martha 3, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson, and Martha 2, was 1 year older than Sally Hemings. And then the same year that Sally was born, John Wayles died, which presumably is why Elizabeth Hemings stopped having children. This put Elizabeth and her children on an uncertain path. Because he had died, the chances of their being sold and separated increased enormously. And this was such, like, I want to focus on Sally's story. And Sally's story means talking a lot about slavery, which we have been doing. I don't want to, like, Annette Gordon Reed gets into all of this stuff, but just what it meant for family to have no control or power over if you're going to be separated or not. Like, there's every shitty thing about this situation. And this is one of the shitty things, is the fact that once your owner died, enslaved people could be separated, mothers from children. Enslaved people weren't allowed to get married, but there were people in long-term relationships, they could be separated, etc. It took a year for the estate to be settled. Ultimately, it was decided that Elizabeth and her 6 children and 1 grandchild, because her children were so spread out in age, her oldest daughter, Mary Hemings, had a son by now called Daniel Farley. So they were all sent together to a farm in Amelia County that was owned by the Wayles family. Then some of the children were separated. I think some of the younger ones from the older ones in the next move to Thomas Jefferson's farm, Elk Hill in Goochland County. But then all the Hemings siblings and their mother were all reunited in 1775 when they moved to Thomas Jefferson's new home in progress, which was called Monticello. Sally Hemings at this point was 2 years old. And so Monticello is a very, very famous house/tourist destination in Virginia. And we'll talk at the very end about the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and all the stuff they've done to fix the house up and make it look beautiful. I think it's on some American money. One of your bills has this house on it. It's the most famous house in the United States, maybe second after the White House. I don't know. But during this entire story, please bear in mind, it was constantly under construction and kind of messy and not gloriously perfect looking. So through all of these moves, the Hemings were kind of shuffling around from house to house. So Martha 2, the daughter of John Wayles, so she was the half sibling of all of the younger Hemings, including Sally. So and Martha too we know she had dark brown hair because later a lock of her hair was found in a locket. So she might have also in some ways resembled, physically looked like some of the Hemings girls. And so she could have chosen not to bring Elizabeth, who was her father's long-term mistress. Some of the writings describe her as concubine. Martha too could have chosen not to bring Elizabeth and the Hemings siblings, who were her mixed race half siblings. She could have not taken them with her when she moved from house to house, But she chose like 3 times in a row to have them around. Like she valued them. She appreciated them. And this could be partially, we don't know what was in her heart, but another person might have said, like, I don't want my father's mistress around. I don't want these reminders of like these half siblings who are like children. Like, this is all, I can't. Another person might not have wanted that. But Martha had had a lot of loss. Like her mother died in childbirth. It might just be she wanted to have people around who she felt comfortable with, who she recognized and knew, and who she knew were sort of, I'm saying sort of, like they were her family, question mark, like they were her half siblings, comma, and also were enslaved by her. So the whole family situation in this is just fucking weird. But she kept choosing to have them around. And Thomas Jefferson, her husband, seemingly also appreciated that the Hemings were to be treated differently from other enslaved people. So he singled out Elizabeth's oldest 3 sons for special treatment. He gave them each more freedom than other enslaved people had. They were allowed to travel around independently. They were educated in trades. They were allowed to learn to read and write. They could hire themselves out to other employers and were permitted to keep their wages. Maybe this was partially because they were Martha II's half-brothers. And so he's treating them, I would presume, the way that John Wayles would have been treating them, the way that Martha II wanted them to be treated, with like special privileges, like not freed, not emancipated, not made into free men, but Thomas Jefferson had them in the situation where they were sort of treated maybe similar to lower class white men who were not enslaved, but they were still enslaved. So we're going to talk a lot about Thomas Jefferson's psychology, but he really had a thing where he wanted everyone to like him and also to think he was a really good guy. So he treated them in this way, and then presumably he thought that would make people look at him and be like, look at that. You know, he's not the other enslavers. He's a cool enslaver. So none of the Hemings boys were put to work in agriculture as the other enslaved men and boys were at Monticello. There were hundreds of slaves there. The Hemings boys would work within the house, or they'd travel with Thomas Jefferson to attend to him. I think he referred to them as servants instead of as his slaves. And that's partially because Thomas Jefferson, kind of liked to live in this fantasy reality where nothing unpleasant was happening. It's a bit of, I kept trying to think, who does this remind me of? Is it the wizard from The Wizard of Oz? Like, he just wanted everyone to be happy around him, or at least he wanted everyone to seem happy around him. And so and to pretend like he was, I'm going to say Thomas Jefferson had enough self-awareness to be kind of embarrassed to be a Virginia enslaver, but not so embarrassed to not be that, but embarrassed enough that he kind of liked to cosplay like he wasn't that, which is why he had mostly light-skinned servants around him who he would call servants. Like, he built his house Monticello on the top of like a mountain. They had to cut off the top of the mountain. And then where the fields were, where the majority of the enslaved people would work and also live, he was literally above it. He didn't have to look at it or think about it. And the only people who were around him, he got them to sort of pretend like they were servants and not enslaved. It's all pretty fucked up. The Hemings women and girls were also exempted from field work, even on days when like all hands on deck, like every enslaved person had to go there at harvest time. The Hemings were not sent there. So the Hemings women and girls performed household chores like sewing, mending clothes, looking after children, and baking cakes. And so the Hemings girls and women were also dressed differently from other enslaved people at Monticello. Like the house staff, again, it's like enslaved people, but the Hemings, like it was just all Hemings all the time inside of this house. And as the Hemings like paired up and started having children, they couldn't get married, but many of them got into long-term committed relationships. Then there was like a new generation of Hemings. And so the Hemings would always work in the house, the Hemings people.
And now for a quick advertising break.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back.
All the other enslaved people would be doing agriculture type stuff. So the Hemings girls and women were dressed differently from other enslaved Monticello women. And Thomas Jefferson was really into fashion and clothes. He was also into architecture. He really was into aesthetics of things. And so he bought Irish linen, muslin, and calico fabrics for the Hemings girls and women's outfits. He wanted to make sure they were not all in the same pattern to avoid monotony in their outfits. He also purchased for them fitted cotton stockings and taking note of their sizes, versus all other enslaved women at Monticello received a uniform made of coarse brownish linen and baggy stockings of woven cloth. And I'm saying this, this is a good example of Thomas Jefferson, who, we're just going to call Thomas J, because that was the name of Macaulay Culkin's character in My Girl, and I prefer him to this guy. So Thomas J was really into, if he was around today, I'm not sure if he would just have some really, he'd have his smartwatch on, all these notifications every day, trying to biohack all the time. But he was really, really, really committed to writing down lists of everything he did and that everyone around him did constantly. So if he'd write down all of the outfits, all the fabric he bought, and how many yards of the fabric there were, and which enslaved people were doing this job this day, what was the weather like today? He just recording everything. So a lot of this story, we know kind of times and dates and figures because Thomas J was writing down everything. Again, I was is this a bullet journal vibe, or would he have Notion templates? He just wrote down everything down. And this is how we know he wrote down the sizes of the Hemings women and girls to get them correctly fitting stockings, because he wrote down that sort of detail. At one point, Elizabeth Hemings' daughter, Critta, she fell ill, and Thomas J paid to send her to a place called The Springs for medical care, and her room and board were paid for by him, by Thomas J. Annette Gordon Reed writes, the everyday existence of the Hemings women and girls encouraged them to think of themselves as different from others who share the same legal status. Yet, they still shared that same legal status of they were permanently enslaved. And Thomas J. could free them, but did not. But I think his thing was also, he's like, I'm going to make these people so happy and content here, they're not even going to want freedom, he thought delusionally to himself. So Thomas J., I'm really trying to include him as little as possible in the story, but he does a lot of stuff. He kept changing jobs, so I need to keep you up to date with what he's doing. So we're up to 1779, which is like in the middle of the American Revolution. Big, important thing that a lot of people were involved with, but not the Hemings, because they were at Monticello just like doing their jobs. And Thomas J. was doing his job, which was being governor of Virginia. And he had been offered some other jobs, but he wanted to stay at least in the state of Virginia because his wife, remember, Martha II, was perpetually pregnant, which if you're keeping a Vulgar History Season 7 bingo card, lack of birth control and women having more children than their bodies were prepared to do marks that square off. Because Martha II was perpetually, like, she was pregnant all the time. And every time she had a baby, she almost died. During their 10 years of marriage, she gave birth to 6 children, 2 of whom survived infancy and childhood, who were their daughters, the aforementioned Martha III, and then another daughter whose name is sometimes Maria and sometimes Mary and sometimes Polly. And that's why I wrote her in my notes as MMP, Maria Mary Polly. So those are the 2 children who survived. But she was constantly pregnant, really not thriving in a pregnant state, almost dying every time she gave birth. Thomas J. was like, I want to be close to her. So that's why he wanted to stay in Virginia and do this job. 1782, Martha II gave birth yet again to another daughter called Lucy. It was a rough birth, and she never recovered from the experience. Martha II died a few weeks later. And while she was dying, this is where the book by Annette Gordon Reed is so important and won the Pulitzer Prize, because she's looking at kind of what the letters were of the people, the like white slave-owning people who were there, were saying was going on versus kind of what Hemings' family oral tradition said was going on. And so I'm going to emphasize the Hemings stuff because she was sick. She was constantly sick. So the Hemings women and girls throughout all this 10-year period would have been tending to her as her helpers, kind of her nurses. Like, they probably would have been there as she gave birth, as she was not doing okay afterwards. They were at her bedside during her final days and hours. Thomas J. also there. Allegedly, as she was dying, Martha II made Thomas J. promise he would never remarry. And this was because she didn't want her daughters to have stepmothers, because if you'll recall, in his litany of people called Martha and Elizabeth, Martha II, her mother, Martha I, had died. And then her father married 2 more times. And just like that chaos of all of it, like, I think Martha II just didn't want her daughters to have to go through that situation. She had not enjoyed seeing her father marry and remarry again. And so Thomas J. promised he would not remarry again. Martha II also, as she was dying, singled out her youngest half-sister, Sally, who was at this point like 8 or 9 years old, a handbell as a memento. And this might have been the bell that Martha II would like ring when she needed Sally to come and help her. But it's interesting that she singled her out. And also interesting that Sally was probably there, or at least Hemings were there to tell her that Thomas J. had promised he would never marry again. Thomas J., inconsolable at the loss of his wife. He locked himself up in his rooms for weeks in grief. Whenever he was going through a really hard time, he also suffered from migraines and health problems. So not doing okay, Thomas J. And then which is why when he was offered a job, and so before he hadn't taken jobs that would take him very far away from his wife, Martha II, because she's going through his pregnancy issues. But now he was offered a job to go to Paris, and he's like, I need a fresh start. I need to get out of here. He was having like suicidal thoughts. Like, he was struggling in a situation. He wanted a fresh start. And so the job in Paris was to participate in peace negotiations with Great Britain because we're in 1782. So towards the end of the American Revolution era, so, peace negotiations, because the American Revolution, to recap, was American patriot people versus the British people. And so the peace talks were going to try to wrap up the American Revolution, I presume. So he arranged for his older daughter, Martha III, to come with him to Paris, where she would go to boarding school. He sent his two younger daughters, MMP and Lucy, who had just been born, to go stay with Martha II's white sister, Elizabeth, I want to say 3? Elizabeth 2. Yeah, Elizabeth 2 is the sister. Anyway, so siblings-wise, we have the now dead Martha II. She had a sister, Elizabeth II, who is still alive and is a white person slave owner. And then most of the Hemings, except for the oldest ones, are also half-siblings to Elizabeth II and Martha II. We only have one Martha left in the story anymore, which is Martha III, but I'm going to keep calling her Martha III just so you remember. Anyway, so MMP and Lucy, the youngest Jefferson kids, went to live with Elizabeth II, their aunt. Their other aunt, their 9-year-old half-aunt, mixed race, Sally Hemings, went with them as the nurse and helper. So this is the thing where enslaved girls up until age 10, 11, 12, they would often be a helper to a much younger child. So no other Hemingses went there with her. Most of them stayed at Monticello while this was all happening. Some went to a few other places, and her older brother, James, went with Thomas J to Paris because he was being trained to be a chef, and he was going to go train with some French chefs in Paris. So they were there for maybe a year-ish, and then the youngest Jefferson daughter, Lucy, who is at this point 2 years old, she died of whooping cough. Elizabeth II's daughter, also called Lucy, died of the same thing at around the same time. So Sally Hemings, who is 10 years old-ish, who had been companion to all these little girls, she's just seeing all this, witnessing all this happening. She's also Sally Hemings, half-sister of Elizabeth II. So what was her relationship to everybody? Unclear. But she's also Sally away from her extended Hemings family. And so Thomas J had been thinking this was devastating to him, and he wanted to have his surviving daughter MMP with him in Paris as well. And he was at this point appointed to a new job also in Paris. So, there's a show called Franklin that stars Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin. It takes place in Paris. I think it's on Apple TV+. I haven't watched it myself yet, but I do understand that in, I think, episode 3, the Chevalier d'Eon appears in what sounds like a really cool way. So anyway, that show is about Benjamin Franklin in Paris. He decided to leave. Thomas J. appointed to succeed as the new American minister to France. And so knowing he was going to be in France for longer, he was right, send my other surviving daughter, MMP, to live with me in Paris. Tout sweet. But Elizabeth II's family were really close to MMP. They had she had been with them for 2 years at this time. She was a little girl. And Elizabeth II had come to love her as parents. They just kind of avoided his letters, didn't really answer his letters. They kept coming up with excuses why she couldn't go. Ultimately, it took 2 years before finally Thomas J was able to get MMP to be arranged to be sent to Paris. So the plan all along was for her, she's a little girl. There had to be a man traveling with her for safety and security. And then also a nurse, lady's maid / helper, who would be one of the enslaved people from Elizabeth II's house. And so they intended it to be this 27-year-old woman called Isabel Hearn. But just when they, after 2 years of arrangements, they figured out, okay, MMP is going to Paris. Elizabeth Hearn was pregnant and so unable to travel. And so it was that 14-year-old Sally Hemings was appointed in her place to go along with MMP to Paris. So picture 14-year-old Sally Hemings, very little, travel experience, other than just going back and forth between Monticello and Elizabeth II's house, like just very Virginia-based, going from home to home. Later in her life, others remember that she would often talk about her trip to Paris. Like this was a defining thing for her. This was huge. This was an amazing experience that she was often talking about throughout her whole life. So she went with MMP. So 5 weeks at sea, the length of time things took to travel places. 5 weeks at sea, she arrived in London. And so she and MMP went to visit some friends, some Jefferson family friends in London who included Abigail Adams, who there's a podcast that, let me just get the name of it. Abigail Adams, not a person I'm going to be talking about in this season, but there is a podcast called Revolutionary Women that is created and hosted by 2 members of the Tits Out Brigade, and they have done an episode with Abigail Adams, so you can learn more about her there. Like, she's not a tits out type person, but interesting, well worth learning about. Abigail Adams was in London at this time. Her husband, John Adams, was the first American ambassador to Great Britain, which I guess is why that's where Sally and MMP went to stay. And so Abigail Adams bought new clothes for MMP and Sally because they're going on to France. And in France, you had to keep up appearances, basically. Poorly dressed servants reflected badly on their employers. And there's some question about, like, should Sally go to France with MMP or should she return to America? Like, her job had been to kind of watch MMP during the boat journey, but they can't send Sally back by herself. And so eventually it was decided by Thomas J that she should come to Paris with MMP to sort of help out. So London, this is 1787. So it was a huge city, still is. But I mean, Sally was coming from these plantation homes in Virginia. This would be like nothing she'd ever seen before. She got these new outfits and stuff. And also, she may not have known this yet, but slavery was illegal in France at this time. So as soon as she got there, Sally would technically be a free person. Thomas J knew this rule. He knew that you were supposed to, if you were an American or someone traveling with enslaved people, you had to declare that you had them with you. And then you would be subject to these fines of 6,000 livres. Thomas J, who was, just so you know, always extremely bad with money, overspending constantly because he wanted to look much richer than he was. His whole plan was let's just have, don't ask, don't tell type vibe. He's just what is it? Don't ask for permission, beg for forgiveness. He's I'm just going to not tell anyone that Sally, this 14-year-old girl, and her brother James, who, remember, he was there to learn about French cooking. He's well, if we don't declare, then maybe no one will notice and I won't have to pay this bill. And he also was Thomas J, I'm not going to tell Sally and James because I don't want them to know, and hopefully no one will tell them and they won't find out that they could stay in France and be not enslaved anymore. So Paris, again, 1787, this is described as at the apex of its grandeur, a global center of politics, culture, and the arts. The city itself was home to over 500,000 people, which is close to the entire population of Virginia at this time. Of these 500,000 people, about 1,000 of them were free Black people. This is also Paris, 1787, on the cusp of when the French Revolution was going to start. And this whole season, this whole extended season 7 Vulgar History experience, we're all building up to understanding how the French Revolution happened and then how it affected Marie Antoinette. And the French Revolution didn't just happen. There was a lot of smaller revolutions or protests and stuff building up. So this was happening. The energy would just been electrifying when they got there. It was an exciting time to be there. And Sally was just 14 years old and just taking it all in. Her brother James was also there to welcome her. So he was at this point 22. She was 14. They hadn't seen each other in 3 years. So the Hemingses were all close to each other. It was a really strong family unit. But I mean, this wasn't her sibling closest in age to her or anything. But anyway, it was probably so exciting for them to see each other. She could give him all the latest news about what was happening in Virginia. He's probably happy to speak English to somebody because most of the other servants employed by Thomas J. Would have been French speaking. Sally was moved into Thomas J's residence, the Hotel de Langeac, perhaps de Langeac. MMP was sent to the same boarding school that Martha III was already attending. Could have been an option to have Sally go with them as their lady's maid, but I think Annette Gordon-Reed talks about all the reasons why that probably didn't happen, and part of that was probably because it might bring attention to the fact that Thomas J had brought enslaved people to France, and he just didn't want anyone to kind of know about that. Anyway, so one of the things that Thomas J had said in his instructions for sending MMP over to be with him was he wanted whoever came with her to be inoculated against smallpox. And then because of all the mix-up and like who's going to go and when, Sally had not been inoculated against smallpox. Thomas J, big believer in inoculation. You can go all the way back in this podcast. I have a whole episode about Dr. Jenner and smallpox vaccine and how that kind of all developed. But Thomas J, a man of science, was really into it all. So she was sent to see the Suttons. So there was a Dr. Sutton, and then he had 6 sons, and that's why it's the Suttons. So it's this family of male English doctors who just went around inoculating people in Europe. So they've been invited to members of the nobility, heads of state. They administered inoculation to King Louis XV, who did die of smallpox, but that's just because they got there too late. And the total cost of this treatment was the equivalent today of about $1,000, which is paid by Thomas J., which included housing and food at the Suttons' inoculation house in the outskirts of the city where Sally stayed for the mandatory 40-day quarantine period. So again, just picturing this 14-year-old girl who, not worldly, had really limited experience of kind of any situation outside of being at Monticello with her family. She was just by herself in this place where most people spoke French. As was how inoculation worked at this point, she came down with a mild case of smallpox from the inoculation, during which time she was monitored and treated. So it'd be like white servants like serving her, which just adds to kind of a surreality to her, perhaps, of what this was like. The Suttons emphasize rest as an important thing. So I don't know how much rest she was used to getting in her like regular life of being like an enslaved child. She would go for walks, like for exercise around for a set period of time each day. And she probably, at this point in this like 40-day quarantine situation, is probably when she began learning French, because it's like literal French immersion. Like everyone around her is French. The Suttons were English, but the servants who she began interacting with were French. She eventually was said to have learned the language well. After her treatment ended, she went back to Thomas J's house, the Hotel de Langeac. So the place where he was staying was more expensive than what Thomas J could afford. But that is something that you'll see a lot in the story. It was more important to him that he look wealthy rather than avoid debt. So this place, the hotel, would have been both Thomas J's and Sally's first experience of indoor bathrooms. There was a whole bathtub room, a whole floor of guest bedrooms. Like he was still like Monticello today is this like glamorous museum, but it was an under construction building site for Sally's whole life, basically, to this point. And this was like an elegant, fancy French like manor place. So we don't know where Sally and her brother James lived specifically when they were there. The hotel had adjacent servants' quarters. There are also some rooms for servants on the mezzanine floor. And the thing about her coming there, though, is like recall. Like her job had been to escort MMP to Paris, and now she wasn't her lady's maid. So she kind of didn't have a specifically defined job. So she would have been at this point kind of at loose ends, like sort of a fifth wheel, which would give her time to sort of learn some French, like experience her new surroundings in her own way, like watch other people to learn kind of what the French customs were for things. And so how she was seen there, I think, was similar to how the Hemings were treated and seen back in Virginia as well, which is like different from other enslaved people, different from other servants. So just in terms of like people who saw her and how they saw the Jeffersons react to her, like she would have been the lady's maid to Martha III and MMP when they came for weekends or holidays or whatever back to visit their dad. So she would have met their friends. And one of Martha III's French friends wrote a letter at one point saying like, "Oh, say hello to Mademoiselle Sally for me," which this is Martha III's like aristocratic French friend referred to Sally Hemings as Mademoiselle Sally. Members of the French upper class did not refer to servants by titles like Mademoiselle. So this indicates that Martha III herself seemed to treat Sally as something more than a normal servant, to the point that her friends picked up on it and said, like, sent her my best wishes and called her Mademoiselle. In another instance, in one of her letters, Martha III passed along Sally's regards to one of her other friends. They're all, remember, they're like really similar age, Martha III and Sally. And so also the house where they were, which was located on the Champs-Élysées, was, you wouldn't have had to go very far to see lots of cool stuff happening. There's so many festivals, religious festivals, secular festivals, like day-long festivals. Sally was not receiving a formal education, but there were many things for her to see and learn just by like living there, seeing what was happening in her own neighborhood. Again, she didn't have a specific job, but her tasks included sewing and mending, probably running errands, maybe helping her chef brother with ingredients and things, helping Martha III and MMP as needed, accompanying them on day trips, like driving around Paris in a carriage with them, and then being also a chambermaid for Thomas J. She was also, and I think this is because slavery was illegal in France, paid for her work for the first time. So she had her own money, and she, for the first time in her life, could choose what to do with her money. She could buy clothing, go to museums with her brother. There was some affordable theater she could have attended. She could give the money to charity, buy gifts for her family. This was from her wages. She wasn't given additional spending money, though her brother James was, and perhaps this was meant for him to share with her. Thomas J spent his own money, because this guy loves A, shopping, B, being in debt. He bought clothes for Sally as well, I think. Again, the whole thing about like what your servants look like reflected on how fancy you were. And so she was also at this point attending balls and dinners and things as Martha III's lady's maid. So she had to fit in. So she's getting these gorgeous outfits. Like, it's such an interesting chapter in her life. There was one anecdote I want to mention. So at one point, there was a violin concert at Martha III and MMP's school. The violin concert was being performed by a 9-year-old mixed race boy named George Bridgetower. So George Bridgetower was born in Poland to a white Polish mother and a black father from Barbados. He became personal servant to an English nobleman. And a few years after this concert, after performing in London, guess who was so moved by his talent, he decided to oversee the musical education? Prinny, a.k.a. the husband of Caroline of Brunswick, a.k.a. the future George IV, a.k.a. the regent, a.k.a. the guy who just keeps jump scaring his way into episodes of this podcast. Something else to put in your bingo card, gratuitous Prinny appearance. Anyway, at the beginning of 1788, Martha III and MMP both contracted typhus, presumably from their school, and so they were sent to stay in Thomas J's house. But so that the other people in the house wouldn't get sick, Sally was sent away for 5 weeks so she wouldn't get infected. So again, she's just having not like nonstop leisure time, but just like a really different experience from in Monticello. Like, first of all, just being on her own a lot, and second of all, just having time to herself to think and learn French and things. So while in France, Thomas J became a regular companion of the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French hero of the American Revolutionary War, character in Hamilton played by Daveed Diggs. And they were doing political stuff together. The French Revolution was, kind of beginning. And Thomas J supported the French Revolution, so he allowed his Paris residence, the Hotel, to be used by Lafayette and other Republicans for meetings. Lower R Republicans, French Republicans. And so during this whole time, in Paris. So Sally and James learned about the fact that slavery was illegal in France. Like they couldn't not learn about that because they were living in the world. Like they had contact with Black and white servants in the house they were living in. They would have met other servants in other households when they're going to events and things. Like they would have met people at the museum or the theater. Like they knew that slavery was illegal. And they probably would have heard that other Black people in Paris were hoping that the oncoming revolution would present an opportunity for Black people to have a better life for themselves. In 1789, the Société des Amis des Noirs, which I think means the Society of Black Friends, engaged in a public struggle to include free tax-paying Black people into the new world order in France. They wanted Black people to also have a seat at the table. As part of their campaign to try and be included, they quoted words of the American Constitution from the American Revolution. Thomas J. was at the meetings of the National Assembly where this was all happening. He didn't comment upon it in writing. His vibe at this point was kind of like, I'm not like other enslavers. I'm a cool enslaver / like, am I an enslaver? Look over there. He wrote stuff about how he was anti-slavery, but also maintained plantations and owned enslaved people. So also, the winds of change are coming through. In the winter of 1788/89, so like the end of 88, beginning 89, winter was one of the coldest ones in Europe in 300 years. We're going to return to this, I think, other times throughout this season because this is a pretty crucial thing. It was so incredibly cold. Sally, James, Thomas J., like people from Virginia were just like, get me out of here. Paris is cool, but like this is a bit too cold. Pour moi. In the midst of this impending collapse of French society and also the cold weather, Thomas J. was like, let's go back to Virginia. Let's leave here. And at the same time, 47-year-old Thomas J. began having a sexual relationship with, by then, 16-year-old Sally, getting her pregnant. And we're going to leave the story at that point because this is a pivotal turning point in the life of Sally Hemings. So next week, what happens next?
So what's funny about how I just ended this episode is that I had naively thought that the Sally Hemings episode would be one episode length. I thought it would be about an hour to get through her story. And I realized at that point, firstly, that I was about halfway through her story and it had been an hour or something. But also, just as I said that final sentence, my neighbor, like the people who I share like a wall with, the wall that is next to where I record the podcast, started doing something that involved us like slamming, I don't know, some sort of mallet directly at the wall. And so I was not able to record anymore, but I was like, oh, but that's actually the perfect place to stop the story. And people, American history knowledgeable people, may know what happens next to this young teenage pregnant enslaved girl in France, and other people might not. So that this will be a bit of our cliffhanger. Next week, we're going to get into part 2 of the story of Sally Hemings. And so just, I want to check in with you all at the end just to let you know what's up, how you can keep up with me if you have thoughts or feedback about this podcast. And you know what? I do welcome all the thoughts and all of the feedback, even if it is in the form of like you giving me like constructive feedback in the form of a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You know what? Like I respect that you took your time to share your thoughts. And I prefer to if you share your thoughts that are positive, but all of the comments are great. You took some time out of your life to just like think about me, and I appreciate that. So I'm on Instagram at the moment at Vulgar History Pod, where my DMs are open. I'm going to be, every time I do an episode, I put a post there so people can share their thoughts and say what they think about it. And so again, Vulgar History Pod on Instagram. I'm also on Substack, if you're there, where I'm doing, I have a weekly newsletter there. So every week, if you subscribe, which is free, to my Substack, Vulgar History, a la carte,
every week in your email inbox, you'll get a little essay that I've written about somebody from history. It's not exactly the same stuff as what's on the podcast. It's different people, but it's just a way that if you like to read historical information rather than listening to it with your ears, you can subscribe to that there. At the moment, I'm talking about women of the Tudor era. So the link to that is in the show notes, but just go to vulgarhistory.substack.com if you want to follow me there. I also have a Patreon where I'm also posting more stuff there. Basically, the Instagram algorithm has been not my fan lately. Like a lot less people are seeing the stuff that I post on Instagram. And I'm like, but I want people to see my stuff. I want people to see these like funny jokes or like pictures of who we're talking about and stuff. So I started putting more of that on Patreon, which you can join for absolute free and see my public posts there as well. So you can join the Patreon. It is at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And when you go there, you can say join for free. And then you can see just kind of like random things I post there or like pictures of people we're talking about and stuff like that. And then if you love it so much, you want to support me financially, if you pay at least $1 a month, then you get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History. And if you want even more content, if you pledge $5 or more a month, you get the access to the ad-free access to the episodes, as well as bonus episodes. So things like Vulgar Piece Theater, where we've like 3.5 hour long episodes talking about various costume dramas. I'm joined by friends of the podcast, Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. There's also special episodes there called The After Show, where sometimes I have a guest where I can't stop talking to them. And so we take it to the after show. And then also So This Asshole, where I talk about shitty men from history, including, if you want to know what happens next in this saga, I have an episode there about Thomas Jefferson. And we also have a lovely and wonderful brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. Common Era Jewelry is a small women-owned company that makes beautiful jewelry and also like scrunchies and hair bows and things inspired by women from history as well as from women from classical mythology. So the pieces are made in New York City. Everybody involved has healthcare and good wages. And their designs include a lot of people we've talked about on the podcast, which is part of why it was a no-brainer to team up with them. So they have pendants and rings inspired by women we've talked about on the podcast, like Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina, Anne Boleyn, and people we haven't yet talked about on the podcast, like Sappho is there. There's a lot of classical mythology people like Medusa and Aphrodite and Hecate, and other people from I, Claudius, like Agrippina is there, Livia is there. And their pieces are available in solid gold, heirloom objects, as well as in more affordable gold vermeil. Vulgar History listeners can get 15% off all items from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. And if you're interested in Vulgar History merchandise, so we have that available. We have t-shirts, stickers, pins. There's nothing specifically tying into this to Series 7 yet. And that's because I'm kind of waiting to see what phrases or concepts really take off. So honestly, my favorite merch ideas are the ones that come up based on things that you, the listeners, share with me. So if you have ideas for merch, let me know. And you can see our existing merch, which is available at vulgarhistory.com/store. That is the best one for any Americans who are still listening to this episode at this point. If you're outside the US, shipping is a bit better if you go to Redbubble. So go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com to get your gorgeous merch that has like various silly in-jokes that you can wear. And if someone else recognizes it, then that's how you know you found another Vulgar History listener, aka a member of the Tits Out Brigade. And how exciting would that be to meet someone else in person? I keep saying get in touch with me. You can do that on my Instagram DMs at Vulgar History Pod, or also if you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's a little form where you can contact me, and that's where you can let me know your thoughts as well. And next week, we're going to get into more, the exciting conclusion of the saga of Sally Hemings, which has a lot of updates about how she is commemorated now in America. And so until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Ann Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History Show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Nowadays, trends and news cycles change faster than we can blink. But there are some things that withstand the test of time. And if you're looking for a connection to something timeless, and maybe also a glimpse of life at a slower pace, I believe everyone can relate to the very human experiences explored in Jane Austen's novels. And that's where I come in. My name is Alison Larkin. I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin. I spent a lot of my childhood in the part of England where Jane Austen lived and wrote, and now that I live in the States, nothing gives me a sense of homecoming quite like narrating her books. On this show, you'll listen to award-winning narration. I'll give myself a pat on the back for that, as well as conversations with actors, writers, and other fascinating people who all share a passionate love for Jane Austen. So please, join me as we embark on a wonderful journey through Jane Austen's work. Be sure to listen and subscribe to the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin, wherever you get your podcasts.